There's a town in British Columbia where the furniture is still inside the houses, chairs pushed back from kitchen tables as if someone just stood up to answer the door, curtains hanging in windows that nobody has looked through in 50 years, a child's rubber boot sitting on a front porch step, still waiting for the foot that left it behind. Nobody broke in. Nobody ransacked the place. The people who lived there simply got up one day, walked out, and never came back. And the strangest part, the part that keeps historians and urban explorers and ordinary people like you and me awake at night, is that nobody can fully explain why. Canada is one of the wealthiest, most modern, most stable countries on the face of the earth. It has universal health care, functioning democracy, some of the most livable cities in the world, and a reputation for being, above all else, quietly fine. And yet, if you know where to look, if you are willing to leave the highways and push into the forests and the tundra and the places the GPS just gives up on, you will find them. Entire towns, entire communities, streets laid out in grids, water towers still standing, churches with their doors still on the hinges, schools with the blackboards still chalked. All of it empty, all of it silent, all of it waiting for an explanation that has never quite arrived. More than 2,000 ghost towns are scattered across Canada, 2,000 places where people built something, built homes and schools and post offices and ambitions and lives, and then abandoned everything they had made. Some of those towns have clean, straightforward explanations. The mine ran dry, the railroad rerouted, the fish disappeared, the company pulled out, but 12 of them, 12 extraordinary, haunting, deeply strange places, carry stories that do not fit neatly into any explanation. 12 towns where the official record and the physical evidence and the human memory of what happened all point in slightly different directions, and where the truth, if it exists anywhere, is buried under decades of silence and moss and the slow, indifferent reclamation of the Canadian wilderness. This is not a list of dusty historical footnotes. This is 12 stories about what happens when civilization encounters something it cannot control. It is about greed and disaster and bad luck and decisions made in panic rooms by men in suits who never set foot in the places their decisions destroyed. It is about people who built something real from nothing in some of the most unforgiving terrain on the planet and lost it anyway. And it is about the places themselves, the buildings still standing, the objects still left behind, the questions still hanging in the air like smoke that never quite cleared. We are going to travel from the fog-drenched coast of British Columbia to the frozen shores of the far north. We are going to walk through towns that time forgot and towns that were deliberately made to be forgotten. We are going to ask the questions that the official records don't answer. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, I think you are going to feel something unexpected. Not just curiosity, but something closer to grief. Because every one of these places was somebody's home. And home, once it is lost, has a way of becoming a mystery all by itself. Let us start at number 12. Tucked into the mountains of British Columbia, about 80 kilometers west of Lillooet, along roads that switch back through granite and pine like something out of a fever dream, there's a small cluster of buildings that real estate agents, and yes, actual real estate agents, listed this place, once described as a fully equipped community. That description is accurate in ways that make the skin crawl. Because Bradian is not just abandoned, Bradian is frozen. There is a difference, and once you understand it, you cannot unfeel it. The town was built in the 1930s and 1940s to house workers from the nearby Bralorne gold mines, which were among the most productive gold mining operations in British Columbia's history. At its peak, the Bralorne mine complex pulled millions of dollars worth of gold out of the mountains every single year. The men who worked the mines needed somewhere to sleep, somewhere to eat, somewhere to raise their children and argue with their neighbors, and feel, however temporarily, like they were part of something permanent. Bradian was that somewhere. It had houses, dozens of them, lined up along quiet streets in the shadow of the mountains. And it had a school and a community hall and all the small infrastructure of ordinary life that people build when they intend to stay. The mines closed in 1971, and when they closed, the people left. But they left in a way that suggests they believed, or at least hoped, that they might be coming back. Because the furniture stayed, the dishes stayed, the curtains stayed. Personal belongings that no rational person abandons permanently were left sitting in their places, as though whoever packed a suitcase that morning was planning to return for the rest of it by the end of the week. The week never came. And then the years came instead. And Bradian sat in the mountains, perfectly, eerily preserved, a three-dimensional record of a life that stopped in 1971 and has not moved since. Urban explorers who have pushed their way into Bradian in recent decades describe the experience not as visiting a ruin, but as entering a time capsule that nobody sealed on purpose. Calendars on walls, magazines on coffee tables, a pair of eyeglasses on a nightstand. These are the details that separate a ghost town from a ruin. The human scale of the things left behind, the smallness of them, the evidence that real people with real routines and real habits lived here and then simply were not here anymore. In 2014, the ghost town was put on the market for $1 million. A group of Chinese investors bought it. 7 months later, citing changes to British Columbia's immigration rules, they sold it again. Bradian has been bought and proposed upon and dreamed over by various investors and visionaries ever since. None of them have managed to bring it back to life. The mountains, it turns out, are patient in a way that investors rarely are. There's a waterfall in Quebec so tall and dramatic and theatrical that early 20th century industrialists looked at it and saw not beauty, but power. Raw, exploitable, economic power. The Ouiachuan Falls drop nearly 90 meters in a single white curtain of water that has been falling that exact distance since the last ice age. In 1901, a man named Damasse Jalbert looked at that waterfall and decided to build a pulp mill next to it. And around that pulp mill, with the systematic confidence of a man who believed absolutely in the permanence of industry, he built a town. Val Jalbert was not just any company town. It was a model company town, the kind that gets held up as evidence that capitalism, when properly managed, can produce something resembling community. The company built modern houses with indoor plumbing at a time when indoor plumbing was still a luxury in rural Quebec. It built a school and a convent and a general store and a post office. It installed electricity. It paved streets. It created, in the middle of a Quebec forest, beside a spectacular waterfall, something that looked and functioned exactly like the good life. At its peak, nearly 1,000 people called Val Jalbert home, and then the pulp market collapsed. The mill closed in 1927. And within a matter of months, not years, months, Val Jalbert went from a functioning, humming, modern community to an empty shell. The departure was so swift and so complete that it has a quality of unreality to it, the kind of thing that happens in stories, not in the documented record of a Quebec county. People packed what they could carry and left. The houses stayed, the school stayed, the convent stayed. The general store, its shelves still stocked, stayed. The waterfall, entirely indifferent to the collapse of everything around it, kept falling. What makes Val-Jalbert unusual among Canadian ghost towns is that its abandonment was so comprehensive and so immediate that the buildings were preserved almost by accident. Nobody came back to strip them. Nobody repurposed the lumber. Nobody had any reason to interact with the place at all, because there was no economic reason to be there anymore. The result is one of the most complete ghost town tableaux in North America. Tourists who visit today, and it is now a managed heritage site, describe the sensation of walking the streets of Val-Jalbert as fundamentally disorienting because everything looks like it should be inhabited and nothing is. Children should be running out of that school. The door of that general store should be opening. The windows of those houses should have lights in them. Instead, there's the waterfall, and there's the wind, and there's the persistent, slightly accusatory silence of a town that was left in mid-sentence and has been waiting ever since for someone to finish the thought. There is something philosophically disorienting about a ghost town inside a national park. National parks are supposed to be about the preservation of nature in its pristine, pre-human state. Wilderness protected from industry, from extraction, from the scarring ambitions of the resource economy. And yet Bankhead sits inside Banff National Park, Alberta, a coal mining town of nearly 1,000 people that operated from 1903 to 1922, and whose ruins now sit on interpretive trails between the parking lot and the mountains, a testament to the fact that the Canadian Rockies were not always considered sacred. They were, for a time, considered useful. The Canadian Pacific Railway built Bankhead. The CPR needed coal. Coal for its locomotives, coal for the boilers at the Grand Banff Springs Hotel, coal to keep the whole magnificent enterprise of cross-country rail running through the mountains. The Cascade Coal Basin beneath the future national park contained it. And so, the CPR did what the CPR did in those years. It built a town, a proper one, with running water and electricity and a hospital, and a YMCA and schools, and the whole infrastructure of settled industrial life. Bankhead was, by the standards of 1910, a well-appointed place to raise a family. It was also, in the view of the people who would eventually decide to preserve the land around it as a national park, a problem. The problem built slowly and then fast. In 1922, after years of tension between the mining company and the increasingly organized labor force, the workers went on strike. The company closed the mine. The official explanation was the strike and the declining quality of the coal and the slumping market for coal across the region. But there was also the uncomfortable fact that running an industrial mining operation inside a national park was becoming increasingly difficult to justify politically. The mine closed. The town was demolished, not abandoned in the romantic, furniture left in the houses sense, but deliberately, systematically dismantled. Buildings were auctioned off and moved to Banff. Structures that couldn't be moved were torn down. The company town was erased. What remains are foundations. Concrete and stone outlines of what was there, like a floor plan left behind when someone removed all the walls. Walking the interpretive trails through Bankhead today, you're essentially reading the ground, tracing the ghost of a community in the shapes of what it once rested on. Visitors report hearing things: the sound of picks against stone, the low rhythmic percussion of machinery. Whether this is the imagination working overtime in a place saturated with historical weight or something else is a question that the interpretive signage politely declines to address. The mountains, as always, are not talking. In the 1890s, Sandon was one of the most consequential cities in British Columbia. That is not an exaggeration constructed for dramatic effect. At its peak, Sandon had a population of 5,000 people, 24 hotels, 23 saloons, multiple newspapers, an opera house, an electric streetcar. A streetcar in a mountain valley in the 1890s, and the intoxicating, slightly delirious energy of a place that believed it was going to be important forever. The silver veins running through the Selkirk Mountains around Sandon were producing staggering quantities of ore. Money was moving through the city the way rivers move through canyons, constantly, powerfully, and seemingly without limit. The first catastrophe came in 1900, when a fire burned most of the city to the ground. This happened regularly in the boom towns of the era. Wood construction, open flames, high winds, and the kind of compressed human energy that tends toward combustion. And Sandon did what boom towns did. It rebuilt. The silver was still there. The money was still coming. The rebuilding was not quite as grand as the original, but it was determined. Sandon was not a town that intended to die. Then the silver market collapsed. The price of silver dropped through the floor in the early 20th century, the way commodity prices do when the world decides it has enough of something, and the economics of extracting more simply stops making sense. The hotels closed, the saloons closed, the newspapers folded, the streetcar stopped running, which is perhaps the most specific detail of Sandon's decline. The moment a mountain city with a streetcar becomes a mountain town, without one is the moment you know something irreversible has happened. The population drained away like water through a cracked basin. By the 1930s, Sandon was a ghost of itself. And then, in 1955, the flood came. The creek that ran through the center of town, Carpenter Creek, which had been a charming scenic feature during Sandon's prosperous years, swelled after a particularly brutal spring thaw and tore through what was left of the city with the casual destructiveness of water that has decided it has somewhere more important to be. Most of the remaining buildings were swept away or catastrophically damaged. The wooden infrastructure that had survived fire and economic collapse did not survive the creek. What the flood left behind is what you can find today. A few leaning structures, the ruins of a city hall, the odd artifact poking out of the undergrowth, and this is the detail that gets the most attention from visitors. Rows of vintage Brill trolleybuses parked in the wilderness, brought to Sandon in the 1990s to be refurbished and then somehow never refurbished, sitting in the mountain air, gathering rust, looking for all the world like a dream that arrived in the wrong place and never found its way out. Billy Barker was a Cornish sailor who had no business being in the interior of British Columbia in 1862. He had sailed from England, crossed an ocean, traveled by whatever means were available through the gold fever landscape of the Pacific Northwest, and planted himself on the banks of Williams Creek in the Cariboo region of British Columbia, with a conviction that must have seemed delusional to the men watching him dig. He went deeper than anyone thought sensible. 52 feet down, Billy Barker hit gold. $12.50 worth of it in the first 12 hours. In 1862, that was not a modest discovery. That was a life-altering, town-founding, 1,000-person attracting discovery. Barkerville became, almost instantly, the largest city west of Chicago and north of San Francisco. That claim sounds inflated, and it is somewhat, but only somewhat. At its peak, Barkerville had a population of around 10,000 people, jammed into a narrow mountain valley, served by hotels and saloons and a theater and a Chinatown and a hurdy-gurdy dance hall and all the chaotic, opportunistic, polyglot infrastructure of a gold rush boomtown at full, glorious, temporary pitch. The town burned down in 1868. A fire started in a bakery, spread with the mercurial speed that wood construction in a narrow valley allows, and destroyed most of the city in a matter of hours. Barkerville rebuilt within 6 weeks. The gold was still there. The will was still there. The rebuilding happened with the kind of speed that only happens when people believe absolutely in what they are building toward. The gold did not last. It never lasts. By the 1880s, the easy gold was gone. By the early 20th century, Barkerville had contracted from a city of 10,000 to a village of a few dozen stubborn holdouts who could not or would not leave. The buildings that the fire had not taken, time was slowly taking. Wooden structures in a climate of deep snow and spring floods do not endure without maintenance. And maintenance requires people, and people require reasons to stay. By the 1940s, the reasons were almost entirely historical. The town was essentially a museum that nobody had officially decided to make into a museum yet. In 1958, the provincial government of British Columbia made it official. Barkerville became a heritage site, preserved and partially reconstructed as a window into the gold rush era. Guides in period costume walk the boardwalks. Actors perform in the theater. The gold rush is reenacted daily for tourists who arrive by car on roads that Billy Barker never could have imagined. The mystery of Barkerville is not the gold. The mystery is what was lost in the rebuilding. How much of the actual history of the original town was overwritten by the preservation effort? How many of the stories of the 10,000 people who lived there in 1867 were tidied away to make room for the heritage narrative? The gold rush produced extraordinary human stories, stories of indigenous peoples displaced from their territories, of Chinese laborers who built the infrastructure and were largely written out of the official memory, of women whose lives in Barkerville were complicated and often invisible in the historical record. Barkerville, the heritage site, is meticulous and well-funded and worth visiting. Whether it is telling the whole story is a different question. Most ghost towns decay. That is part of their essential nature. The abandonment, the absence of maintenance, the slow biological reclamation of the wilderness, reasserting itself over the human imposition. Wood rots, glass breaks, roofs collapse, the forest pushes in from the edges. This is the natural history of abandonment. Kitsault did not get this memo. Kitsault is a ghost town that is perfectly preserved, not because anyone has been maintaining it, but because the materials it was built from in 1979 were modern enough, and the timeline of its abandonment recent enough, that the decay has barely begun. And the reason Kitsault was abandoned at all is so strange, so abrupt, so nakedly economic in a way that strips away any pretense of inevitability, that it has become something of a case study in what happens when a corporation decides a community is a cost rather than a home. The molybdenum mine at Alice Arm, British Columbia, was the reason Quetzal was built. Molybdenum is a metal most people have never heard of and yet use every day. It is a hardening agent in steel alloys, critical for the production of everything from pipelines to aircraft to surgical instruments. When molybdenum prices are high, molybdenum mines are extraordinarily profitable. When molybdenum prices crash, molybdenum mines become extraordinarily expensive to operate for no return. In 1979, the mining company built Quetzal from scratch, constructing a complete modern town site, 272 housing units, a shopping center, a recreation center, a hospital, a pub, a library, to house the workers and their families who would staff the mine. Quetzal was genuinely well-designed, genuinely comfortable, genuinely planned as a permanent community. Approximately 1,200 people moved in. 18 months later, the price of molybdenum collapsed. The mine was shut down. The company gave workers 30 days' notice. 30 days. 1,200 people who had moved their families, enrolled their children in schools, made friends, and begun to feel rooted, given 30 days to pack and leave. And they did. Within a month, Quetzal was empty. The furniture in the recreation center stayed. The equipment in the hospital stayed. The books in the library stayed. The bottles behind the bar in the pub stayed. Because nobody was coming back, and nobody had any reason to strip a place that was already fully paid for, and of which the company had no further use. The town sat in the coastal forest of northern British Columbia, perfectly intact and completely empty, for over 20 years. In 2004, an Indian-American businessman named Krishnan Suthantharan bought Quetzal for $5.7 million. He had plans, ambitious, rotating plans, that shifted over the years from creating an international think tank to developing liquefied natural gas export infrastructure. Some of those plans remain in discussion as of today. What Quetzal remains, as of this moment, is a perfectly preserved, fully furnished, immaculately eerie monument to the speed with which a corporation can decide that a community is no longer economically viable. Every curtain still hangs. Every appliance still sits in its place. The rec center, the hospital, the pub, all waiting in the coastal fog for a purpose that has not yet arrived. Martin Nordegg was a German-born businessman who arrived in Canada in 1906 with the specific intention of finding coal and making a fortune. He was charming, energetic, well-connected, and possessed of the particular brand of optimism that turns wilderness into opportunity, and opportunity into something resembling destiny. He found his coal in the Rocky Mountain foothills of Alberta, and he built around it a town that bore his name. By 1914, Nordegg had a population of several thousand people, a sophisticated mine operation, paved streets, a hospital, and a coal briquette plant that was, at the time, the largest in the British Empire. Martin Nordegg, personally, could look at the town of Nordegg and see the physical embodiment of his own ambition made real. And then the First World War began. Martin Nordegg was German. Canada was at war with Germany. The Canadian government seized his assets, interned his business partners, and effectively erased his connection to the town that bore his name. He was permitted to leave Canada, but not to return during the war. By the time he was eventually allowed back, years later, the town had changed hands, the mine had changed operators, and the connection between the man and the place he had built had been officially, bureaucratically severed in the way that only wartime governments can manage. Martin Nordegg lived until 1948. He never fully recovered his connection to or his fortunes from the town he had named and built and lost. The mine itself carried on for decades under new ownership, but it did so under a shadow that the town never fully escaped. In 1941, an explosion in the mine killed 29 workers. The memorial to those men stands near the mine entrance today. A list of names, a piece of stone in the foothills, a formal acknowledgement of the cost of coal extracted from a mountain. The explosion did not close the mine. It kept running. But something about the fabric of the community shifted in the way it always shifts when a community loses 29 of its men in a single morning. The confidence goes out of a place when that happens. The permanent feeling, the sense that this is a place where people can build lives and expect those lives to continue, gets replaced by something more provisional. The mine finally closed in 1955 when the shift from coal to natural gas and oil in Alberta's energy economy made the Nordegg operation increasingly unviable. The residents left over the following years, not all at once, but in the steady attrition of a community that no longer has a reason to hold together. What remains at Nordegg today is remarkable. One of the best preserved early 20th century mining complexes in Canada, designated a National Historic Site. Its briquette plant and tipple and surface buildings still standing in the mountain air. Visitors come to walk through it and imagine the noise and heat and scale of an operation that once employed thousands. The 29 men in the memorial are still there too, in the only way that the dead can remain in a place, as names on stone, and as the particular quality of silence that settles over a place where something terrible happened and was never quite resolved. Ocean Falls holds a Canadian record that nobody who has heard it would voluntarily pursue. It is one of the rainiest places in Canada, receiving over 4,000 millimeters of precipitation per year. That is not a typo. 4,000 millimeters. The annual average for Vancouver, which Canadians already consider deeply wet, is around 1,200 millimeters. Ocean Falls receives more than 3 times that. The rain comes off the Pacific in great gray curtains, falls through the mountains, pools in the valleys, and makes everything simultaneously lush and relentless and slightly oppressive in the way that only a place where it rains 4,000 millimeters per year can be. And yet, people went there. In 1909, a pulp and paper mill was established at Ocean Falls, on the central coast of British Columbia, accessible only by boat or float plane. The mill produced paper. The paper produced jobs. The jobs produced a town. At its peak, Ocean Falls had a population of around 5,000 people, a hotel, a hospital, a school, an indoor swimming pool in a remote coastal rainforest, and the stubborn, slightly defiant vitality of a community that has chosen to exist somewhere most people would consider uninhabitable. The swimming pool is one of the details that stays with you. Who decides to build an indoor swimming pool in a place that gets 4,000 millimeters of rain per year? People who intend to stay, that's who. The mill changed ownership multiple times over the decades, and each change brought new uncertainty. The provincial government of British Columbia eventually took it over, and in 1973, under the newly elected NDP government of Dave Barrett, Ocean Falls became the subject of a political commitment. The mill would be kept running, the community would be sustained. It was a genuine attempt to preserve a remote community against the logic of the market. It did not work. The economics were simply too unfavorable. The mill closed permanently in 1980. The government relocated residents with financial assistance, The town emptied. The rain kept coming. What is left at Ocean Falls today is being systematically reclaimed by the rainforest in the way that only a Pacific coastal environment can manage. Fast, thorough, and without sentiment. The hotel is a ruin of spectacular proportion. The hospital sits empty behind vegetation that is pushed through windows and doors and is making its way through interior walls. The swimming pool, that defiant symbol of a community's intention to stay, sits filled with standing water and fallen debris. A small number of people, a handful in recent years, as few as a dozen, have remained or returned to Ocean Falls, living in the few habitable structures, sustained by a fishing economy and a connection to the place that outlasted every institutional reason for being there. They represent something the official history of Ocean Falls doesn't quite capture: the fact that a community is not just an economic unit, and that the decision to stay somewhere is not always rational and does not need to be. At 4:10 in the morning on April 29, 1903, 90 million tons of limestone, detached from the eastern face of Turtle Mountain in the Crowness Pass region of Alberta, and buried approximately 2 kilometers of the Oldman River Valley under 30 meters of rock. The slide took 90 seconds. In those 90 seconds, Frank, a coal mining town of about 600 people that had been established just 3 years earlier, had the eastern portion of its residential district and a substantial section of its mine infrastructure buried under debris that moved so fast and with such force that it traveled up the opposite valley wall and partway down the other side before stopping. Between 70 and 90 people were killed. The exact number has never been established with certainty because the rock that killed them also buried them, and not all of them have ever been recovered. The survivors of the Frank slide did what survivors do. They kept living. The town of Frank rebuilt or tried to. The remaining residents stayed on the parts of the valley floor that the slide had not reached. The mine reopened. Life, in the insistent, somewhat stubborn way that life has, reasserted itself among the living. But Turtle Mountain was still there. And Turtle Mountain, geologists who examined it in the years after the slide observed, was not finished. The mountain had the wrong kind of rock structure. Layers of limestone tilted toward the valley at angles that made further slides not merely possible but probable. The town was living in the shadow of something that had already moved once and showed clear structural signs that it might move again. By 1917, the town of Frank had been effectively dismantled, not by another slide, but by the combination of a declining coal market and the provincial government's deep reluctance to encourage human habitation directly in the path of a mountain that engineers kept describing as unstable. The houses that were movable were moved. The businesses closed or relocated. The geographic entity of Frank contracted to almost nothing. Today, the Frank Slide Interpretive Center sits at the edge of the debris field, and the debris field itself, a landscape of jumbled gray limestone boulders stretching across the valley floor, is one of the most viscerally unsettling natural environments in Canada. Not because it looks dangerous, but because it looks permanent. The rock that fell in 90 seconds in 1903 will be there for thousands of years. The town that it buried is gone. The mountain that dropped it is still being watched. Most towns that are abandoned because of something that already happened. A mine that already closed, a flood that already came, an economy that already collapsed. Lemieux, Ontario is unusual. Lemieux was abandoned because of something that had not yet happened, but that science said was coming. And the decision to empty the town before the disaster rather than after it is one of the strangest, most deliberate, most quietly tragic acts of community dissolution in Canadian history. Lemieux was founded in 1850 on the south shore of the South Nation River in eastern Ontario. It was a mill town and farming community. Nothing particularly dramatic, nothing particularly unusual. A small Ontario village of the kind that the province is full of. What was unusual was the ground beneath it. The soil in that part of eastern Ontario is Leda clay, also called quick clay, a geological legacy of the Champlain Sea, the saltwater body that covered much of the St. Lawrence and Ottawa valleys immediately after the last glacial retreat. Leda clay is stable under normal conditions. It is extraordinarily unstable when it is disturbed or when water infiltrates it in certain ways. It liquefies. It loses all structural integrity and flows like a thick liquid. And when it flows, everything built on top of it flows with it. By the late 1980s, geological surveys of the South Nation River Valley had identified Lemieux as being on ground with extremely high landslide risk. The analysis was specific and it was alarming. The clay beneath the town was in a condition that made a catastrophic slope failure, not a remote possibility, but a likely outcome on a geological timescale that included the near future. The town was not warned vaguely. It was told, with the careful precision of engineering reports, that the ground it sat on could give way. Between 1989 and 1991, the residents of Lemieux were relocated with government assistance. The buildings were left standing, the town was emptied, and then everyone waited. On April 16, 1991, the South Nation River Valley Wall at Lemieux collapsed. A section of earth roughly 200 meters wide and 600 meters long liquefied and flowed into the river, taking the empty buildings of the town with it. The slide was enormous. It temporarily dammed the river. It created waves downstream. It generated a debris flow that was visible from great distances. It would have killed everyone in Lemieux, had anyone still been living there. The precision of the warning, the fact that the evacuation was complete before the disaster, that the science was right and the decision to act on the science was made in time, is an extraordinary thing. And yet the image of an entire town, standing empty, waiting to be swallowed by the ground it was built on, carries a quality of tragedy that the accuracy of the prediction does not entirely dispel. The town knew it was going to die. It cleared out and waited, and then it died anyway. And the ground where it stood is now a studied, monitored section of riverbank. And the community that once lived there exists only in the memories of the people who were relocated and in the geological record of what the clay beneath them finally did. Hidden Inlet is one of the most remote places in British Columbia, which is saying something, because British Columbia contains some of the most remote places in Canada, which is itself one of the most vast and sparsely inhabited countries on Earth. Accessible only by water, surrounded by mountain walls, shrouded for much of the year in the low coastal fog that the Pacific pushes inland in great gray masses, Hidden Inlet was, from the perspective of a copper mining company in the early 20th century, ideal. It was remote enough that nobody else was using it. It had copper, it had water power, and its remoteness meant that whatever the smelter did to the surrounding environment, there would be nobody nearby to object. Antioch was built at Hidden Inlet, beginning around 1912, when the Granby Mining Company established what would become one of the largest copper smelting operations in the British Empire. At its peak, Antioch had a population of around 2,500 people. Miners, smelter workers, engineers, their families, living in a company town of genuine scale and sophistication. There was a hospital, a school, a recreation center, a company store, a bowling alley. There were organized sports leagues and a community newsletter, and all the social infrastructure of a town that people were building as though they planned to be there forever. And the smelter ran day and night, producing copper and producing something else as well. Sulfur dioxide, in quantities so enormous that the fumes destroyed every living plant in the valley surrounding Antioch. The mountainsides above the town became bare rock and dead wood, stripped of all vegetation by years of smelter emissions. The valley in which Antioch sat was, by the time the mine closed, an industrial landscape of striking and terrible completeness, a place where human extraction had achieved such thoroughness that the land itself had been chemically altered. The mine and smelter closed in 1935. The Depression had driven copper prices to levels that made the Antioch operation unviable. The company pulled out. The people left. Within a few years, Antioch was empty. A fire in 1942 destroyed most of the remaining surface structures. A fire in an empty town, which adds a particular note of finality to the story. What remained were foundations and the bare mountainsides and the deep silence of a valley that had been economically exploited to its limits and then left to whatever recovery it could manage. The vegetation has been slowly returning for nearly a century. The trees are coming back generation by generation, covering the scars with green. The foundations are still there under the undergrowth. If you know where to look, if you can get there, which requires a boat and a commitment to remoteness that most people do not have, you can still find Antioch in the traces it left in the rock and earth. A place that was built, that extracted, that poisoned, that closed, that burned, and that is now being slowly, quietly forgiven by the forest. Whether the forest's forgiveness means anything is a question the valley declines to answer. Every other town on this list was abandoned. Gagnon was demolished. There is a difference, a significant, philosophically important difference, and it is that difference that puts Gagnon at the top of a list of mysterious abandonments, because the mystery of Gagnon is not why it was left behind, but why everything that made it real was so thoroughly, deliberately, systematically destroyed that today there's almost nothing left to indicate it was ever there at all. Gagnon was built in the 1950s in the Manicouagan region of northern Quebec, carved out of boreal forest as a planned community for the workers of the Iron Ore Company of Canada, which was operating massive iron ore deposits in the region. It was not a rough mining camp. Gagnon was designed properly, architecturally designed, as a livable, modern, functional town. It had a hospital, schools, churches, a cinema, a shopping center, sports facilities, paved roads, a small airport, and at its peak a population of around 3,500 people. It had civic pride, it had community organizations, it had the full texture of a real place where real people had built real lives over the course of 3 decades. The Iron Ore Company announced in 1982 that the mine would close. The announcement was made, and then the timeline that followed was one of systematic, organized, total dissolution. The provincial government negotiated relocation packages for residents. The departure was managed and documented and assisted. People were offered money to leave and help moving when they did. By 1985, Gagnon was empty. And then, over the following years, the buildings were torn down, not left to decay, torn down. The church, the cinema, The hospital, the houses, the shopping center, all of it demolished. The materials were salvaged where possible and removed. The site was cleared, the airport was decommissioned. The roads were left to be reclaimed by vegetation. The town of Gagnon, which had existed for 30 years and housed thousands of people, was erased with a thoroughness that suggests an active intention to leave no trace. Why? The official explanation is practical. Liability, maintenance costs, the expense of leaving structures standing in a remote location with no ongoing purpose. These are real considerations. They are not entirely satisfying ones, because other abandoned Canadian towns were not demolished. Kitso still stands. Bradian still stands. Val-Jalbert still stands. The decision to demolish Gagnon rather than abandon it represents a choice, a deliberate, funded, organized choice, to ensure that the town did not persist as a physical reminder of its own existence. There are satellite images of the Gagnon site that show a cleared, overgrown footprint where a city used to be. The roads are still faintly visible from above, running in geometric patterns through the boreal forest, leading to building pads that hold nothing. People who lived in Gagnon for decades, who were born there, who went to school there, who got married there, can visit the site and find almost nothing that confirms their own memories. The town they grew up in has been physically removed from the landscape. There are former residents of Gagnon who have spent years documenting what was there, collecting photographs, recording oral histories, assembling the evidence of a community that the physical record has been scrubbed of. Their work is an act of resistance against erasure, a collective insistence that the fact of their having lived somewhere together matters more than the economics of what happens to the land afterward. Whether that resistance is winning is unclear. The forest keeps growing over the foundations. The roads keep fading. And Gagnon, the real Gagnon, the one with 3,500 people in it, and a cinema, and a hockey rink, and all the complicated, irreplaceable reality of community, exists now only in the memories of the people who carry it, and in the photographs they have saved, and in the satellite images that show, if you know how to read them, the ghost of a street grid beneath the returning trees. 12 towns, 12 silences, 12 different ways that a place stops being a place and becomes instead a question. Canada's ghost towns are not simply historical curiosities, not just interesting stops on a road trip through the wilderness, not just aesthetically compelling ruins for photographers seeking atmosphere. They are something more unsettling and more important than that. They are evidence of a pattern that runs beneath the surface of the country's history, the pattern of a resource economy that builds communities as means to an end and abandons them when the end has been achieved. The copper is gone, the silver is gone. The coal is gone, the pulp market collapsed, the molybdenum price crashed, and the communities, the schools and hospitals and bowling alleys and swimming pools and memories go with them, as if they were never more than temporary infrastructure for a permanent extraction. But the towns push back against that framing in their own way. They push back because the people who lived in them refuse to be temporary. The former residents of Gagnon, who documented what was there, are pushing back. The handful of people who stayed in Ocean Falls after the mill closed are pushing back. The families of the 29 men killed in the Nordegg mine explosion are pushing back in the specific, enduring way that a list of names on stone pushes back against forgetting. The furniture still sitting in the houses of Bradian is pushing back. The waterfall still falling beside the empty streets of Val-Jalbert is pushing back Though the waterfall, to be fair, has no opinion about any of this and is simply doing what water does. The mystery of a ghost town is not really the mystery of why it was abandoned. The reasons for abandonment, economic, geological, meteorological, political, are almost always recoverable, with enough research and patience. The real mystery is what a town is, when you strip away the people who made it one. What is left when the community leaves? Is it still a place? Is the meaning of a place contained in its physical structures, or in the people who moved through them, or in some combination of the two that doesn't survive the separation? Billy Barker's gold is long gone from Barkerville. Martin Nordegg never fully regained what the war took from him. The people of Lemieux watched the ground swallow what they had built. The people of Gagnon watched their town be deliberately taken apart. And the people of Kitso were given 30 days to become ghosts of themselves before the company moved on and the rain and the forest closed in behind them. What these 12 towns share is not just abandonment. What they share is the experience of having been real, fully, completely, human-like real, and then having that reality called into question by the forces that decided their fate, and the buildings that remain, and the foundations that remain, and the street grids visible from satellites, and the furniture and the curtains and the boots on the porches, and the names on the memorials. All of it is a form of testimony, an insistence in the language of physical things that something happened here, that people lived here and mattered here, and built something here that meant something to them, whatever it meant or did not mean to the corporation or the government or the geological event that ended it. The land is not going to tell you any of this on its own. The forest does not care about the smelter that killed it or the new trees that replaced the dead ones. The river does not remember the town it swallowed. The mountain does not record the 90 seconds it took to bury Frank. But the people do, and the photographs do, and the satellite images, and the archaeological surveys, and the oral histories, and the names on stones, and the books in the library at Kitso that nobody has checked out in 40 years. All of it does. Canada has over 2,000 ghost towns. This has been 12 of them. 12 stories about what happens when the gap between what a place is and what a corporation or a government or a geological force decides it should be becomes too wide to bridge. 12 reminders that the distance between a living community and an empty lot is, historically speaking, not as large as we would like to believe. The towns are still out there. The furniture is still in the houses. The waterfall is still falling. The mountain is still being watched. And somewhere in the northern British Columbia fog, in an apartment building where nobody has lived since 1982, a library book is sitting on a shelf with a due date that passed decades ago. Nobody is coming to collect it. If this video made you feel something, and I think it did, because these places deserve to be felt, not just watched, then the most powerful thing you can do right now is help someone else find this channel. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss what comes next. And if you know someone who loves Canadian history, or ghost towns, or the strange, complicated, beautiful, haunting stories that get buried under the official version of things, share this with them. Because these 12 towns deserve to be remembered. And the best way to remember them is to make sure as many people as possible know they were there. The people who lived in Gagnon have been fighting to be remembered for 40 years. The least we can do is watch a video about it. Subscribe. I will see you in the next one.
Disclaimer: this video has been created solely for educational and informational purposes, educational and documentary. The content is based on an analysis of historical hypotheses and private research, in particular the works of R. Nicolai, which may differ from generally accepted scientific data. We do not claim that the theories presented are definitively true and encourage open scientific discussion. All materials are used under fair use for critical analysis and commentary. The author does not condone misinformation and recommends that viewers consult peer-reviewed scientific publications to obtain a complete picture.